Up first, JFK gets backed into a corner. For anyone who thinks seriously about the Kennedy administration, two topics are right at the top: civil rights.
The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities.
And the space program.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon.
Truth is, Kennedy never cared about either of these two things until the day that he was forced to. When John F. Kennedy was campaigning for president, there were a lot of topics he talked about.
Unless the United States is second to none, then this country's survival is in danger, and so is the cause of freedom around the world.
But the whole time, there were two topics that never came up: civil rights and going to the moon. Not in his Democratic convention speech.
For the problems are not all solved, and the battles are not all won. And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier.
Not in his debate with Nixon.
I'm not satisfied to have 50% of our steel mill capacity unused. I'm not satisfied when the United States had last year the lowest rate of economic growth of any major industrialized society in the world.
Civil rights just wasn't a priority. Neither was going to the moon. But that was all changed by a sequence of events over 2 months in 1961. April 12th, Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human in space. The Russians had launched Sputnik 4 years earlier, and now it's clear they are way ahead of us in space. 8 days later, April 20th, the White House realizes that the Bay of Pigs has failed. Now the Russians have a foothold in America's backyard. Kennedy calls Vice President Johnson chairman of the Space Council and asks him to come up with something fast in space. So maybe space can be the Hail Mary pass that diverts everybody's attention away from everything that's going wrong for Kennedy. So that's April 20th. May 5th, Alan Shepard becomes the first American in space. May 14th, 9 days later, the Freedom Rides start. That's where 7 black and 6 white young people got into a bus in Washington, D.C., headed for New Orleans, with whites in the back seats and blacks in the front, or blacks and whites sitting together. May 24th, the bus is firebombed in Anniston, Alabama. The next day, May 25th, President Kennedy speaks to Congress.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
A week later, mobs riot around the Freedom Riders bus in Montgomery, and the Alabama governor declares martial law. Now, the year before all of this, Kennedy had signed an executive order. It said all federal agencies had to examine their hiring practices, and that all federal contracts had to include anti-discrimination clauses. Now that we were going to the moon, NASA was about to start hiring 250,000 people in Alabama, Texas, Florida, Mississippi, and Louisiana.
The president and his party drove to the base of the giant Saturn. Saturn will carry an American crew to the moon in this decade.
It was also going to give out billions of dollars in contracts. At the time, NASA was a young agency and pretty small. But as it grew, along with its mission, it was going to make huge changes in communities in the South. If you want to know how all of this turned out, you can read the book behind me, We Could Not Fail, which I wrote along with Stephen Moss. There's a paperback version, and you can also get it in an audiobook form from Audible. Next up, can the space program really end America's race problem? Here's a story about the Russians possibly creating a space weapon and the president's opposition party using it to get what they want, all while the country worries about mental fitness. And if you want to know what any of this has to do with Black history, stick around. In 1957, the Russians put up a satellite. Some people were frightened.
It's frightening.
Some people weren't.
Not too disturbed about it, but
The people making policy were divided too, but for a different reason.
We congratulate
Soviet scientists upon putting a satellite into orbit.
One of the witnesses on yesterday compared the present situation to the challenge that faced America after Pearl Harbor. In some respects, I think it is an even greater challenge.
Before Sputnik, the Republicans were saying, cut defense spending. Nuclear arms will solve the problem for us. And the Democrats were saying, no, if you do that, you're going to leave America vulnerable.
The briefing indicated that the Soviet atomic energy program was making steady progress with a view to providing nuclear warheads for their family of missiles as well as other nuclear weapons.
Now, the Russians seem to have a new space weapon.
But I imagine we will be able to catch up.
2 months after Sputnik, America tried.
Another setback for the United States in the race into outer space. Here are official Defense Department films of the launching of the 72-foot missile, a loss of thrust, and fall back to Earth in split seconds.
Now, all of this, and I know this is something you don't know, was going on while everyone was worried about the mental state of the President of the United States.
Of course, this is very distressing news to all of us, and I know that each member of the committee feels as I do. We hope that it's not serious, and the President has our prayers for early and, I hope, complete recovery.
A couple of days before the Vanguard explosion, President Eisenhower had a stroke.
Few could have expected to see President Eisenhower out again so soon after the news of his illness.
He got out of the hospital pretty quickly, but he started slurring words in press conferences, and people definitely noticed. Now the Democrats really ramped things up. They were saying that the reason Eisenhower wasn't paying attention to Sputnik was because he was basically out to lunch. They started saying, especially Johnson, that we needed to spend more money on space. So what's this got to do with black people? Lyndon Johnson had this firm belief.
Johnson came of age, of course, in the 1930s, and many people who came of age during the New Deal and the Great Depression had this idea that Southern poverty was at the root of the system of racial injustice. He also thought that part of the reason that resistance to integration was so fierce was that there was so little to go around in terms of resources.
Johnson's idea was, if we can change the economy of the South, we can do two things. First, we can grow the economic pie. That would end racism. But there was also a second thing.
The task is to give 20 million Negroes the same chance as every other American to learn and grow, to work and share in society.
Johnson thought if we create a new economy with new kinds of jobs, then no white hiring manager will be able to say, well, black people can't do that, because with new jobs, nobody could do that. I'm not saying any of these attitudes were right. I'm just saying this is how he thought. Johnson and other Southern senators needed a huge new project, a project they could put down south, where they could use government money to hire tons of people. They knew the Republicans would never go for it unless there was a way to say, we're doing it to beat the Russians. That is where the space program came from.
Johnson was the leader of a group of Southern Democrats who saw the space program as a main chance for their region, a chance to transform the South and to make big headway on dealing with the problems of racial injustice in the region.
And so he started holding hearings and giving speeches to talk about how we were behind in space.
Tonight, the communists have established a foothold in outer space. It is not very reassuring to be told that next year we will put a better satellite into the air. Perhaps it will even have chrome trim and automatic windshield wipers.
And when he made it to the White House 2 years later, Johnson made it happen.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon.
It all seems kind of dopey that the space program could end race discrimination, but at the time, there were a lot of people who thought that it might be true. Jim Jennings spent 35 years at NASA, most as a senior official.
Lyndon Johnson and Robert Kennedy was looking for a way to help integrate the South, and they saw that the space program was a federally funded program and found out that the Republican Party was interested in funding this to beat the Russians to the moon or whatever. So they thought this was a good opportunity to have a federal program that they could get the high blacks in to integrate that part of the government and also influence the local community. I'd heard these things. I didn't have a lot of facts on it, but we'd heard that the president was interested in getting blacks to come work for the space program.
If any or all of this is news to you, I have a book I want to suggest. It's the one behind me, We Could Not Fail, which I wrote along with Stephen Moss. There's a paperback version, and you can also get it in an audiobook form from Audible. Next up, Jim Crow, the problem they wanted to solve. Last week, this comment came in after a video where I mentioned Jim Crow in the Navy. It's a good question. The answer touches on, among other things, the 14th Amendment that bars insurrectionists from being in the government, a president getting impeached, a close election with false claims of voter fraud and threats of violence if the losing guy doesn't get in. All that, plus disputed slates of presidential electors. Imagine yourself in 1865. April 9th, the Civil War ends, along with 200 years of slavery, torture, debasement, and free labor in the South. Black people are free. A lot of black people are armed, and white people in the South are terrified. 6 days after the war ends, the president is murdered. 2 months after that, the new president starts taking over state governments in the South. He picks a judge who had hated secession to be the governor of Mississippi. Then he installs new governors in Georgia, Texas, Alabama, South Carolina, and Florida. But 5 months later, that governor in Mississippi is gone, and the state enacts the first black codes. The other southern states follow during the next few months. They strip away black people's rights, including the right to bear arms. In Mississippi and Alabama, there are special police forces to carry it out. So as the South is taking away black people's rights, Congress passes the 14th Amendment. It says formerly enslaved people have rights, and it bars any officer of the United States who engaged in an insurrection from holding office. Now it's the following year, 1866. The president tells all of those Southern governors that he appointed to step down. So now the Confederates are back in charge in the South. But there's a midterm election that year, and the president's party gets trounced. Congress sends troops back down south. These are the people who came to be called carpetbaggers. Now, Southern legislatures have Northern soldiers standing over them, so they repeal the black codes. Even so, no Southern police force ever stands up against white people who discriminate. Life is still awful for most black people, but at least they were allowed to vote. This is Hiram Revels, U.S. Senator from Mississippi, Congressman Benjamin Turner of Alabama. This is Samuel A. McElwee, a state legislator in Tennessee. The president had been firing all of Lincoln's cabinet secretaries, but then the new Congress voted that he couldn't do that unless the Senate gave their permission. He tried to go ahead and fire the Secretary of War anyhow, but the secretary said no, and barricades himself in his office for 2 months. The president is impeached over this whole thing because, remember, Congress said he had to ask for permission first. Now we jump ahead again 10 years, where there's a disputed presidential election. It's really close. One party screams voter fraud in Florida, Louisiana, Oregon, and South Carolina. They send alternate slates of electors to the House. People start organizing to march on the Capitol on January 6th. Then there's a deal. Rutherford B. Hayes is allowed to become president. In exchange, the government pulls all the federal troops out of the South. Every black legislator is disempowered. White legislators, who say they're fighting voter fraud, take away black people's right to vote. riots and lynching create terror in black communities, and white governments stop funding black schools. A man named Sidney Katz got elected governor of Florida on a platform of no education for blacks. Restaurants are segregated, train cars, water fountains, bathrooms, labor unions. This is Jim Crow. It lasted almost 90 years. Real quickly, it's helpful to look at what the U.S. did in a similar situation. After World War II, the U.S. military ran Germany and Japan. Germany was split in half. Japan's entire constitution was rewritten. International war crime tribunals were set up. The Nuremberg trials for Germany, and General MacArthur set up one in Tokyo. The Germans had imposed Jewish codes. The Southern legislators created black codes. Japan and Germany had slave labor. At the end of that war, the U.S. made it stop.
America's most famous battleground is a camp again, with a road dividing the blue and gray. There is no other dividing line now.
It's always easier to demonize the bad guys when they're from another country. The end of civil wars are always all about reconciliation. But still, 150 years on, it really would have been great if America only had one standard when it comes to addressing evil. Finally, how Houston handled its Jim Crow problem. In 1959, Houston, Texas was brutally segregated. The buses, the schools, the movie theaters. If you were black and you went to see the Oilers in the AFL championship game, you were only allowed to sit in the end zone. Segregation ended in Houston all at the same time, but for 3 different reasons. The 3 things were baseball, NASA, and the greatest civil rights demonstration that never happened. Of those 3 things, baseball was actually the first. Businessmen started making noise about building a domed stadium in the late 50s. To do it, though, they needed voters to help pay for it. That meant black voters, too. So they tried to recruit this man, Quentin Meese, who ran Houston's black YMCA. The stadium boosters had told Major League Baseball that everything was all set. Black people were on board, but then Quentin sent them a letter of his own.
I dictated that letter to my secretary that was sent up there and said that we supported the idea of getting baseball in Houston, provided that there would be no segregation.
Of course, Houston got their team, and when the Astrodome opened, black fans were allowed to sit wherever they wanted. The NASA one actually took a lot longer. There's a trivia question that NASA people like to ask, and it's this: what is the first word spoken by a human from another planet?
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
But here's the thing about that. Houston wasn't NASA's first choice. It wasn't President Kennedy's either. But right before Kennedy gave this speech, NASA got a gift from Rice University.
Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Rice gave the government an enormous chunk of land in Texas to build a NASA center. But there was a problem.
If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place?
President Kennedy was pushing hard for integration. Well, Rice University's charter said the school existed to provide for the instruction of white Texans. In 50 years, the school had never had a black student. The government couldn't accept the land unless Rice changed the charter. Simple, right? Change it. Well, no. When they tried, a group of alumni sued. It took years of court cases before Mission Control was able to open. And last is the greatest civil rights protest that never happened. Gordon Cooper was an astronaut. In 1963, he took the longest space flight ever by an American. When he got back to Earth, the country went nuts. He went to the White House. He spoke to a joint session of Congress. And there were parades for him in D.C. and New York. There was a parade planned in Houston, too, but right at the moment that it was going to start, activists were negotiating to desegregate the city's movie theaters. They had a plan to gain national attention for their cause. Otis King was one of their leaders.
We had people in the parade route who were going to block it.
Students from all-black Texas Southern University stuffed protest signs under their clothes and blended into the crowd.
I think we probably had about 40 people, and about half of them would have moved into the street and blocked the parade. Half would have moved behind and kept them from turning around or going in another direction.
Houston had been telling America it was a different kind of Southern town. This would expose them. Protest organizers were on the phone negotiating with Lowe's Theater Company in New York as the Cooper Parade got underway.
We didn't tell them exactly what we were going to do, but we told them it would make the national news.
The group had their own deadline, one that left enough time to send runners out to get word to the protesters and tell them whether or not they had a go. Within minutes of the fail-safe point, Lowe's theaters capitulated. The protest was canceled, but for the first time, Houston's movie theaters were open to blacks. Today's justice advocates know that they stand on the shoulders of giants, but sometimes it's really helpful to say who specifically those giants were and what exactly they did. If any or all of this is news to you, I have a book I want to suggest. It's the one behind me, We Could Not Fail, which I wrote along with Stephen Moss. There's a paperback version, and you can also get it in an audiobook form from Audible.